Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese. In this series, we're exploring what resilience means to the long-term sustainability of our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and now even pandemic. In this episode, we consider how disaster resilience is being redefined to include the changes in cost, severity, and frequency of natural disasters that we're witnessing around the world. We'll also look at how this visible shift is being viewed through the economic lens on a national scale. We know that money spent now saves far more in future recovery costs, but how is that knowledge changing our planning and actions? Let's look at three of the major population centers in California: Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, and see what types of impacts may occur from earthquakes in those areas. When people think about large earthquakes in California, they often focus on the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. That quake and the fires that followed killed some 4,000 people and devastated much of the city by the bay. What followed was a physical and economic recovery that took decades. Today, our ability to anticipate the impacts of future earthquakes in heavily populated areas is based primarily on previous events like the 1971 Sylmar quake, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, or the Northridge earthquake in 1994, and what we can model based on those past events. But changes in modern urban infrastructure, made vulnerable by multiple layers of interdependencies between water, electricity, gas, and other lifelines, as well as a growing dependence on internet and telecommunications services, have thrown many of our assumptions into question. In 2018, the U.S. Geological Survey developed the Haywired scenario to address those exact concerns. The Haywired earthquake scenario was designed to model and study impacts on the San Francisco Bay Area from a repeat of the magnitude 7 earthquake on the Hayward Fault that occurred in 1868. The Haywired scenario provided local and state governments with some clarity and recommendations about how to prepare, not just in terms of physical hazards and impacts, but also to take into account environmental impacts related to fires worsened by water interruptions, lifeline and power grid interruptions, and with them, internet and telecommunications failures. A key takeaway from the scenario was that the tens of billions of dollars that the Bay Area region cities and utilities have already invested in seismic upgrades, retrofits, and replacement of older buildings and infrastructure since the Loma Prieta earthquake can potentially save hundreds of billions of dollars of structural damage, but still may be insufficient to meet the other challenges created by such an event. Scenarios like Haywired focus attention on measures that can be taken to make our built environment safer and ensure economic stability. These scenarios can only be successful when the information going in is based on sound research data. Christine Goulet is the Executive Director for Applied Science at the Southern California Earthquake Center, SCEC. I asked her about how her work in ground motion modeling can help protect infrastructure elements, from critical facilities like power plants and dams to other vulnerabilities like housing, transportation, telecommunication, and information grids.
Even if we think about this ground motion problem in this simplified way, there's a lot of places where we can better understand, model the physics, and reduce the uncertainties. And this reduction of uncertainty that we do through our research helps us having more accurate ground motions. In the end, if you have more accurate ground motions, you do a better design that's more appropriate for the demand. If we don't really know and we have a wide range, well, your ground motions could be this or that, then you're going to have a design that might be over or under designed, and it's not a good use of resources.
Are there key locations that should be targeted that would have a greater impact on a quick recovery?
If we were to have a very large earthquake on the San Andreas Fault, right now, and that's what the rest of the world thinks of Southern California. To the city of LA, in terms of structural damage, might not be the worst. Maybe Puente Hills, that is straight under the city, is the biggest issue. However, San Andreas has the possibility to rupture the water supply system in multiple places, and this could take months to get repaired and get water back in Los Angeles. So different scenarios could affect different parts of of society in a different way. If you think broadly, California could have an earthquake pretty much anywhere. So everywhere is at risk for a fairly large earthquake. And again, you don't have to be experiencing a very large earthquake to have large consequences, because if even a magnitude 6.7 like Northridge was fairly small, but it occurred right under the valley, so it caused a lot of damage and casualties and so on.
Ross Stein is the co-founder and CEO of Temblor, whose mission is to help people understand their seismic risk. When I spoke with him, he talked about how mitigation doesn't just impact building safety, but rather it's a complex web of interdependent actors and actions.
So imagine you're a business. You previously thought that your earthquake exposure was your building. You know, you put all your employees in your building, and you need to concern yourself with whether or not your building is sufficiently resilient to earthquake shaking and that nobody will be injured. Well, guess what? Over the last year and a half, we haven't even been in that building. Your employees are still working, but they're distributed all around the community. So suddenly, a problem that was really a point problem, what's the issue for this building in its location with its proximity to faults and earthquakes, has changed. It's now a portfolio. It's 1,000 points of light. It's all these locations, the locations of your most important asset, which is not your building, it's your people. And they're spread around. So the whole business of understanding corporate risk now looks a lot more like an insurance portfolio, because you have to concern yourself with everybody's resilience.
When we look at the earthquake threats facing California, everyone thinks about the San Andreas Fault, the big one. But your research and risk assessments has shown that there are scenarios in which smaller faults can cause greater damage. Can you tell me about that?
We all know about the San Andreas, and for good reason. It's the most active fault. It slips at a higher rate than all the other faults in the state. And so, by and large, over the long haul, it's going to produce more large earthquakes than other faults. But it is by no means the only fault we've got. The state is laced with many faults of many orientations. To pull one out of a hat that would be important, the Newport-Inglewood Fault, which gave us the 1933 Long Beach magnitude 6.5 earthquake, that ruptures all the way through central Los Angeles, right up to Century City and Beverly Hills. And there it joins the Santa Monica Malibu Fault, which heads west, and the Hollywood Fault, which heads east. So a situation we could imagine is a large earthquake, let's say a magnitude 7 on the Newport-Inglewood Fault, triggering another large earthquake on the Hollywood Fault. And then in that sequence of events, we would have hit Long Beach, Marina del Rey, Century City, Beverly Hills, and downtown Los Angeles. So the likelihood of ruptures in those faults are much lower than the San Andreas. But the consequences of even a small earthquake on those faults is much higher than the San Andreas.
The notion that smaller faults like the Newport-Inglewood Fault can trigger other faults in Santa Monica and Hollywood and cause greater damage than the more well-known San Andreas Fault is news to most people. But not to Ken Odell at MHP Engineers.
So we're starting to connect San Diego to Newport and to Palos Verdes a little bit more directly. That really raises the question as to the San Diego mechanism is not based on a short fault anymore. It's now based on a much larger opportunity. You know, the Northridge earthquake in 1994 was a fairly localized event in the San Fernando Valley. There was damage scattered as it came back into the LA basin, but it was still a localized event. With San Diego having a longer fault rupture potential, we're now looking at earthquakes that are going to impact not just communities, but regions. And those regions are going to be stretched not only in damage, but also in response. Resources are now going to be taxed when the community that's been affected is much greater. I think the greatest earthquake threat that faces California is indifference and reliance. We can't scare people, we have to inform people. When we scare people, they tend to become indifferent. It's overwhelming, they don't know what to do with it. That is a huge threat to earthquake survivability in California. The other one is reliance. I think too often we rely on the code, we rely on our engineers or our architects or our public officials to set a standard. And by setting that standard, we rely on the standard being good enough. And so I believe that both of those components take away the important need for the end user, the client, the owner, the developer, the tenant, to have a stake in the conversation.
Getting every stakeholder into the conversation can't just happen by itself, and it can't just come together when the government starts the conversation. When I spoke to Professor Frank Zerunian at USC, he explained that the path to resilience requires something greater than just the people involved.
We will not be able to respond to disasters but for governance, in other words, the collaboration of the various sectors coming together at various stages, pre and post disaster, to address the issue. Indeed, government actually has a substantial role in this orchestra of various actors coming together to govern. So it's critical for government to be the conductor of that orchestra, if you will, in order to make sure that the other sectors not only are facilitated, but facilitated in a proper way to make sure there's transparency, accountability, efficiency, effectiveness, and yields results, which is what we call good governance.
To learn more about ways to improve resilience by focusing on both hazard mitigation and recovery in disaster situations, I spoke to Lori Schumann. Lori is the Senior Programs Director of National Initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners. She has personal experience in dealing with concurrent disaster recovery, having worked in Puerto Rico, which has dealt with crippling earthquakes and hurricanes.
In some communities in Puerto Rico that are lower income, those communities experienced catastrophic failure of their homes because those homes were not braced, they were not bolted, they were not built to code. And right down in another community right next to Guanica, for example, in Puerto Rico, in Ponce, we had a community where not all of the infrastructure failed and not all of the households lost their homes because there was code in place and fortification of this infrastructure. So we can take a similar community adjacent to one another and you apply mitigation principles to this community and good code and good standard of operations and maintenance, and it survives and the other community doesn't. So we know what works. We know code saves. We know brace and bolt saves. We just have to make it accessible to the communities that need it the most.
There is never a one-size-fits-all solution. How do you see federal assistance helping different regions based on their unique needs, like hurricanes in the Southeast and earthquakes and wildfires in California?
You know, when we look at vulnerability of a community, let's take a community in Los Angeles that may be very prone to seismic disturbance. The definition of vulnerability of a community is in large part informed by several factors. Fortification and the state of the building condition. Is there infrastructure in place that needs critical servicing? These factors contribute to a community's vulnerability and exposure to risk. And the way that we look at protecting communities is by trying to figure out how can we ensure that infrastructure and housing is in a better condition, that it is fortified, that it is braced and bolted, that there is infrastructure in the community that's flexible, that gas lines don't break, that water lines don't break, that the grid stays online. This requires a significant level of investment. Reducing infrastructure exposure will equate to a safer community when there is an earthquake.
And what is the view about the value of investing in mitigation?
Avoiding disaster and avoiding the trauma of disaster should be our primary focus in this nation. The avoided costs of a disaster should be a preeminent concern when we're considering investing in infrastructure and housing. When we deal with an event such as an earthquake or a flood or any major peril, the amount of funding put into repairing is just a sliver of what the costs are to a community.
Earthquakes happen in many areas of the nation. In California, their impacts will be felt in large population centers, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from other parts of the country or from people who deal with other kinds of natural disasters. Roderick Scott is a certified floodplain manager at L&R Resources in Louisiana. He became a pioneer in the use of federal and state income tax credits for the rebuilding of historical properties.
Basically spent 30 years as a general contractor and then came down to New Orleans after Katrina and Rita and took part in elevating some 36,000 homes in Louisiana now. And my little hometown across from New Orleans, Mandeville, last 4 weeks ago, and Ida has been working at flood mitigating its buildings since Katrina. And we've gone from 750 flood claims after Katrina for $25 million. We only had 64 flooded buildings this time. It's unbelievable. It works. And we've got to have buildings that don't flood. We've got to have buildings that the roofs don't blow off and the fire doesn't get them, and they don't collapse in earthquakes. And we're not talking about building all new buildings for this. We have millions of existing buildings we have to retrofit. And imagine the jobs that we create by doing this in a time where we need more employment and more jobs.
In January 2021, Congress passed the STORM Act, which will provide additional funding for disaster mitigation.
January 1st, the STORM Act was passed, which is a multi-hazard mitigation loan. It's for flood and wind and earthquake and fire. None of us planned in our ownership of these properties, our investment in these properties, to have to come back and retrofit our buildings. And the idea behind this resilience revolving loan is that it would be provided and attached to the property taxes, just like a PACE. In PACE, it's called Property Assessed Clean Energy Loan, but we're going to do resilience. So this way, we're going to save millions of properties across the country.
How would you see a model like this working in the case of seismic disasters?
You know, this property assessed model of financing is transferable. It's like a forklift. I can take the pallet from over here from flood, and I can go right over into earthquake, and we can start bolting and bracing buildings with this financing model that we've created that, you know, has long been needed and is finally starting to come to reality.
As we've learned today, the major earthquake threats we are facing in California are not just the quakes themselves, but the potential harm done to infrastructure, both built and wired, and to the communities connected by these fault lines. Research has shown the direct economic benefit of investing in mitigating earthquake damage by retrofitting soft-story apartment buildings, for example, can return $13 for every dollar spent. Throughout the course of this series, we have spoken to experts about many aspects of the resilience story and learned that most of the answers are already in our hands. We've learned that retrofitting existing buildings is both affordable and practical, and that new performance-based design can bring newer buildings in cities back online just days after an earthquake. We've learned that public policies are evolving to encourage resilience. We've learned that one of the most important elements of achieving true resilience is sharing information and the building of a community of stakeholders who share the same goal. The U.S. Resiliency Council is committed to bringing together these stakeholders to form a movement of like-minded people who see the importance of resilience, the benefit of proactive planning, modeling, and resilience programs, investments, and incentives. If there's one thing I hope people can take away from this series, it's that our guests and others like them are already working to deal with the threats presented by natural hazards and build a more resilient future. Hopefully, we will all continue working actively to make sure that the future natural hazard events do not become disasters. Thank you for joining me on the Resilience Advantage.